This is a course on sexuality, and the first lecture tonight will be a look at different perspectives that one can take on sexuality. Now, quite often, what I do when we're in person is I have students write words that are sexually charged on the board, but I don't think that's really necessary for tonight. But we are going to be dealing with terms that you don't often hear in a classroom, and it's often a good idea to get used to that and be willing to use them and accepting of those terms. Now, sexuality is obviously a critical force in shaping our lives. It's a part of how we see ourselves, and it greatly impacts our self-esteem. It's ever present as we relate to others at both romantic and platonic levels. And we're constantly confronted with media message on enhancing sexuality through various products. You've probably seen late night television where they're trying to sell people supplements of testosterone, sometimes perfumes made out of pheromones, and sometimes condoms and vibrators and things like that. So these messages are constantly being seen in public media. We also see sexual themes being prominent in entertainment. When I was a child, or actually when I was a kid, a teenager, nudity started showing up in movies, and it was a big sensationalistic thing. Nowadays, nudity occurs on cable TV all the time. You see it in any movie that has a greater than a certain rating. Undoubtedly, there'll be nudity in that movie. So, and also you see it in commercials and in other aspects of our society. You constantly see sexual themes being prominent in entertainment and elsewhere. Sexuality is a central and all-pervasive theme of human existence. And this is fairly obvious. At its best, it charges our lives with energy, excitement, and love. It offers a deep sense of connectedness and is capable of spanning and healing social divisions between people. It also creates family, the primary unit of society and the source of our future generations, and for many people this is the most important aspect of sexuality. However, it does have its bad features. At its worst, it brings prejudice, anguish, violence, and disease, and we will spend some of our time this semester talking about these various aspects of these negative kinds of occurrences. You'll do some of the discussing, and I will do some of the discussing. It's also important to become aware of the variety of sexual lifestyles that occur in our society, and the concerns of those who are unlike ourselves. There are people out there who don't have the same sexual and societal concerns that you do, and we have to sort of be conscious of that, and also realize the fact that just because we believe differently from somebody else, it doesn't mean that they are wrong or we are wrong. Now, when one deals with sexuality, or anything for that matter, there are some things that are necessary. To make good decisions requires a number of things, and among them is accurate information. And this semester, I will be trying to provide you with accurate information, and also you will be providing each other with accurate information about certain issues when you run your discussions. Good decision making also requires the ability and the opportunity to develop a personal value system. This personal value system is something that you may have already developed, but that it doesn't mean that it has to stay the same through your entire life. Sometimes people's value systems change as they learn more things, and it's quite possible that your value system may experience some shifting during this course. Good decision making also requires a discussion of possible and probable outcomes of sexual behavior. And this is, again, true of other things as well. Any kind of behavior, you should consider what the possible and probable outcomes are. If you engage, for instance, in unprotected sexual activity, you could be at risk of developing a pregnancy, or could contract sexually transmitted diseases, STDs. Now, our sexuality is influenced by many factors. Some people believe that our sexuality is determined by biology or genetics. Others believe that sexuality comes as a result of culture and socialization, and that biology has very little to do with it. Some people believe that their psyche processes information as a result of the experiences that they have that are perceived as either positive or negative, and that these experiences ultimately cause the person to become who they are. Some people believe that we become who we are as a result of the combination of all of the factors that I've mentioned above. What is clear is that we get strong and conflicting messages about sexuality from all of these sources. Now, our sexuality is influenced by many different sources. For instance, our family is a source of influence relative to our sexuality. We get genetics, obviously, from our family, and to whatever extent genetics determines our sexuality, that's inherited from our parents. We also see scripted behaviors in our family. It's not unusual for children to behave in many respects like their parents. They see these behaviors all the time and they mimic them, and eventually they become a part of themselves. So part of this is the debate between nature versus nurture. In other words, how much of our sexuality is determined by what we've inherited genetically, and how much is a result of what we've inherited through our nurturing, through being exposed to our parents and their behaviors. There is some debate of what the impact of parental influence is on sexuality. Keep in mind that at this point, the traditional nuclear family in our country is less than half of United States households. So the rules about what our society is like have been changing constantly. One thing which I'm sure you're aware is that courts almost always gave and give children to the heterosexual parent in the case of a divorce until recently. And one must keep in mind that heterosexual parents have homosexual children. So it's not simple. There's no guarantee that if you're a heterosexual parent that you will end up having heterosexual children. And so simply giving custody to a heterosexual parent is not always the wisest thing to do. Now, it also turns out that good parenting skills are more important for raising healthy children, and that's related to things not just sexual but everything. Now, how does the family influence the development of healthy sexuality? Well, it teaches us our gender roles and expectations. It teaches us about love and affection and patterns of touch, and sometimes it teaches us what's bad about certain kinds of behavior in parents and patterns of touch. From our family, we develop a sense of our physical selves, and we assume patterns of social interaction. There are also parental approaches that lead to healthy sexual development. Parents should be loving and supportive of their children, and children receiving affections will be more likely to give those affections or give certain affections to others. One thing that has been shown by research is that boys stop getting affection earlier than do girls, and this may have a negative influence later on. Most parents also reinforce gender stereotypes fairly early on. They countenance boys' aggressive play, but if girls show aggressive play, that's not looked on as kindly. Similarly, girls are sort of taught to be interested in motherhood, beauty, and domestic tasks. And of course, if boys demonstrate that, that's often not met with a lot of friendliness. We also are influenced by our friends. The peer group plays a powerful role in shaping values and attitudes about sexuality. Things like peer pressure, social judgments, and opportunities interact to influence healthy development and can often leave a negative mark. For instance, peer pressure, if one gets the bad end of that, can lead to things like low self-esteem, depression, and feelings of inadequacy. And this is, in fact, where most of our sexuality education comes from. Sometimes that education is accurate, sometimes it's not. And sometimes our peer group is perceived as being more knowledgeable than our parents, even though that peer group may have very little experience. If we were in a room together and I asked you, where did you learn about sexuality, you would more likely say that you learned about it from your friends more often than you learned about it from your parents. I myself remember putting my tie on the day I got married and looking over at my father, who was tying his tie next to me, and saying to him, "So, Dad, is there anything you want to tell me?" Because up until that time, my parents had never told me anything about sex. I learned about it initially from a cousin who was my age. Culture. Culture is anything and everything that humans learn, including appropriate behavior, and we learn from culture about how to act in matters sexual. All cultures have rules that govern sexual conduct. Some of those rules are permissive and some of them are restrictive. In our pluralistic society, some of these rules are coming into conflict because some members of our society are very strict on matters sexual. Others are very liberal about matters sexual. And the result is that sometimes these things can come into conflict. Also, events like 9/11 can change interpersonal relationships and also mental and physical health, and they can have an influence on sexual activity and sexual behaviors and sexual opinions. Popular culture also chugs right along. You get sex in popular culture all the time. Michael Jackson, the scandals with the Catholic Church, John Benet Ramsey, who you might recall was a little girl who was murdered and was in the news quite a bit, Robert Blake, O.J. Simpson, the swimsuit issue of Sports Illustrated, which comes out annually and is big news. Popular culture has a tremendous influence on sexuality in our society. Our schools also have an influence. Let's talk first about K through 12 schools. Now, most parents support sex education in schools, but some do not. The National Guidelines Task Force recommends teaching 6 key concepts that relate to human sexuality. Those include human development, relationships, personal skills, sexual behavior, sexual health, and society and culture. And you probably recall that in recent years, there's been a big push for abstinence-based curricula only, with no exposure to physiology or methods of birth control, etc. And the evidence is that abstinence-only education doesn't work in the long term. There have been research studies that show that abstinence-only education is actually better for the first year, but after the first year, its effectiveness in sex education and keeping people away from sexual activity drops precipitously. Finally, college. Once a person goes to college, as you have, you're usually exposed to new people and new things, and this often happens when you're away from parental influence. So you become more responsible for making more decisions, and freedom and diversity are experienced unlike anything that's previously experienced. And sometimes people can keep control of their behavior and not change very much, but sometimes, as I'm sure you're aware, people can go wild, just like the ads that you used to see for Girls Gone Wild and Guys Gone Wild. Quite often that can happen once one goes to college. Your behavior changes drastically.